Okay.
Okay, and we had in our last session a large number of people attending also, and it was still possible to do a round of introduction, but if we try to do this by having everyone introducing themselves speaking, it would take too long. So maybe if we could make use of the chat box, and I can introduce myself there, for example, saying my name, my position, and my affiliation. And please feel free to share as much or as little information you'd like to about yourself, but it would be nice to have an idea of who we are, where we are. Yeah. Okay. Also, in relation to the chat box, I would kindly ask you to use the chat box when we open for general discussion, and I'll do my best to write down the people who want to ask questions, and then I'll pass on the digital floor to you. Yes, I see that most of you have your mics off now, and this is really useful if you're not the one who are speaking, because otherwise it can be a bit noisy. And when I'm speaking, you might hear the occasional bird, but I don't think there's going to be any major disruption. Please let me know if it is. Right, okay. I'd like to once again welcome everyone and introduce the special guests for our session today, Monica Haller and Bono Mcelhaney, who kindly agreed to participate in our session today to discuss their book, Language, Capitalism, Colonialism Toward a Critical History, published in 2017 by the University of Toronto Press. Monica Haller was born and raised in Montreal, Quebec. She did her post-secondary education in the United States and has spent her career at the University of Toronto with stints of various lengths in Europe and Latin America. A past president of the American Anthropological Association, she currently chairs the Royal Society of Canada's Committee on Public Engagement. She has received honorary doctorates from the University of Bern, Switzerland, and Université de Bretagne Occidentale in France. Her research has focused on the role of language in the making of social difference and social inequality, with a focus on shifting ideologies of nationalism, particularly in Francophone North America, and on shifting ideologies of language in late capitalism. Bono Mcelhaney is principal of New College at the University of Toronto and associate professor of anthropology and women and gender studies. She is the former director of women and gender studies. She regularly teaches courses on unsettling settler colonialism, living on the water in Toronto, and water and social justice. She directs Great Lakes water work at New College with support of a Faculty of Arts and Science teaching and learning grant. This initiative focuses on decolonial, feminist, queer, and anti-racist approaches to environmental justice, with a focus on water. Its projects include designing and redesigning a cluster of courses on the Great Lakes, research and teaching collaborations with community partners, designing experiential learning opportunities for students, and curating public events. So welcome, Bono and Monica, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
In terms of the structure of how our meeting is going to work, in the first 20 to 30 minutes, Makoni and I will start the conversation by asking Bono and Monica a few questions. And after this initial part, we open the session for a general discussion for around 1 hour. So the whole session should last around 90 minutes. Okay, and to start off, let me just admit a few more people in the room. Yes. 5 more people joining us, and we see 53 people. Amazing. Okay, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you for us to start. And the first one is connected to a reflection that you make in the preface of the book on radical hope, which I find very inspiring. And perhaps one of the reasons why I find it so inspiring, I started thinking about it, is because it's very timely but also atemporal. And a comment that you make is that you draw on Arendt's work and also on Junot Diaz, and you mention the number of years apart of both contributions, and both touches on the issue of hope. And I was inspired to use it in my own teaching as well. Right after we transitioned to online modes of teaching due to the pandemic of coronavirus here, we moved our teaching at the University of Oslo to online modes. And I wanted to start a conversation with our students to check in with them how they were coping. And I was interested in sharing with them the idea of radical hope as a everyday life strategy, as you mentioned in your book. And then I wanted to read more about Junot Diaz, whose work I didn't know. And this, like I said, was in the wake of the pandemic. And I believe, as many of you had to make very quick plans to adapt. So I started reading more about Junot Diaz because I didn't know his work much. And I came across some pieces on the news covering how he faced allegations of sexual abuse and harassment. And that had some implications to some positions that he held. And I started thinking, okay, so what do I do from here? And in a way, it connects to a point that you make in your book when you talk about the history of sociolinguistics. And I'm here using quotes, the founders of sociolinguistics, and how Delheims has also met allegations of sexual harassment. And I wasn't sure exactly whether I should cite Diaz without entering this history that I knew little about, but I still wanted to inspire students to find radical hope as a strategy for their or our everyday lives. So I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about radical hope, and if possible also how this can, or maybe not the relation, but radical hope, but the politics of citation. Yeah.
Monica, maybe shall I go first? And then, yeah. First of all, I just want to thank all of you for participating in this conversation. I approach this conversation with a great deal of humility, knowing all that I can learn from the people that are in this room, and regretting in many ways that we're interacting in this way rather than person to person, so that we would have the opportunity for the robust conversations that we could have. I also want to flag that we're speaking from a historic moment where we're facing multiple crises. And I want to reflect on that. I know that this can be a disembodied form of interaction, but this is a moment where we're thinking concretely and more forcibly than ever before or again about how to challenge anti-Black violence, how to think about policing, how to think about how we deepen our commitment to anti-racist and decolonial work. That is very much part of the conversation I'm engaged in right now at the University of Toronto. The college I'm principal of supports programs in African studies, Caribbean studies, equity studies, Buddhist psychology, and mental health, as well as a program called the MasterCard Foundation program that supports students from Africa at the University of Toronto. And we're reflecting both on the strengths of that work, the contributions it's made, and the work we have yet to do. We're also speaking from this moment of global pandemic, where I'm listening to each of you as we opened up describing the moments, the ways in which you are grappling, and life is harder now with whatever sets of circumstances you're facing. We're seeing a moment that diagnoses what we need to attend to, what we haven't attended to. It helps us diagnose what matters. And that is a somber moment. I think it's a somber moment. It is also a moment of hope. it's a moment, as I talk to my colleagues in the college, where we're thinking about grief and healing and organizing and trying to find the right balance between those. So I won't speak for Monica, because actually Monica and I have had some sustained discussions about the notion of hope, and we might want to speak to that, because we debated about whether to put notions of hope in the book. So from my perspective, I need not just to be able to say no. Naomi Klein, who is a socialist writer based here in Toronto, has a book called "No is Not Enough." It's not enough for me to say this is what what we cannot do, what we can no longer do. I also need a vision of what we're working towards. And for me, hope is about that. Hope is having a vision of what we're working towards. Hope is also finding the moments where we are already instantiating that future in our ongoing interactions, even if briefly. So I wanted to think about hope. I also think that without notions of hope, we might get stuck in the status quo, and that's ultimately a conservative position. We don't have an opportunity to think through. We did start the book, and it was another somber moment. It was a moment when we were just finishing that preface as Trump had been elected and president of the United States. And we knew that was going to be a very challenging moment where fascist ideas, racist ideas, colonial ideas would have a proponent in one of the most powerful offices in the world. And Junot Diaz had written an article in the New Yorker the week after Trump was elected, where he drew on Jonathan Lear's ideas of radical hope to note that the work has never been easy, and it will not be easy. And for us, the quote spoke to the moment. At that point, some of the critique of some of his sexist actions had not become public. It became public after. So I have a couple of responses. One is, I still want to draw on the notion of hope, and I don't need to draw on, for the work I do, because I'm not working on Dominican literature, I don't need to draw on Junot Diaz to do that. He draws on Jonathan Lear himself. In our final chapter, we have a section called "This is How We Hope," and we draw on a number of scholars, socialist scholars, feminist scholars, queer scholars imagining Indigenous and Black futurities, who elaborate notions of hope, vision, and optimism. And I think that's what I would do at this moment. Or, if we have another edition at some point, we might have to speak exactly to the question that Raphael asked. So I would call the names of Sarah Ahmed and Lauren Berlant and Jose Munoz, Leanne Simpson, Sylvia Winter, Angela Davis, Stefano Harvey, Fred Moten, Karen Recollet. And some of these names are probably names that circulate globally, but others are scholars here in this place, in Toronto or Southern Ontario or in Canada, who are doing the work on the ground. And I think that it's appropriate to have that mix. So yes, I think we need hope. The question of citing Himes and what it means to have to grapple with our own tradition is maybe the moment at which I'll tip over to Monica, and we can flip back if we need to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm the not the hope person. So we had lots of discussions about this. I mean, that has a lot to do also with my own family background. So I think for me, I don't need an actual vision. I need to be in the struggle. I guess I talk a lot about sort of rethinking and reimagining, but I don't think of that as prior to the everyday life work of trying to be true to certain values and trying to make them real in some way. So I fully expect, and I've certainly had the experience of failing regularly, and that's fine. I want there to be a conversation. I want there to be a space for a conversation. I want to be able to struggle. And, maybe I reconciled myself to the notion of hope through that. I guess that's my version of it. But the word often makes me nervous because I worry that it can tip over too easily into various notions of utopia, which have their own potentials for terror, for domination, for things that are the antithesis of the world that I want to be living in. So I think there's lots of different ways to do this, and I prefer the kind of the broader range with maybe other kinds of more processual terminologies. So that's one attempt to answer your question, Raphael. I think it's possible to retain that energy for struggle, remembering that it's also fine to be really exhausted and have to go home and rest for a while and recharge, because otherwise you just can't do it. And that, I think the trick in many ways is to be able to be attentive to when you need to withdraw from battle for a moment and allow that to happen. So that's the thing I want to say about hope. About who's doing the talking about it. I think that's part of one. It's one of the reasons why I think it's important to think about why we cite people. And the concern I think that I certainly had with Himes is that he's cited for notions like narrative inequality as someone who was attentive to questions of inequality and power in the field, but in his personal practice contradicted that in ways which produced concrete results for the field, which were the antithesis of what we thought he was imagining. So voices were silenced through his actions, which, talk about narrative inequality, silencing somebody really does that. So I'm not going to cite Himes as someone who inspires me on that notion. And as Bonnie says, we don't need to, mostly these questions, and I think this is one of the struggles that we had in the book, is to avoid the great person view of intellectual history, intellectual genealogies. There are lots of people in these conversations, but I think the citational practices we do, need to be careful about the ideas and how they come through particular personal histories, and sort of what we do with the construction of the person as opposed to the construction of the ideas. And I think and I'm not trying to say that this is not an argument that it's the work that matters, not the person. On the contrary, and I think the entire way in which we constructed our book is about that. But rather that if the idea is something that inspires us, there's a lot of work that we can do to work on that idea without attributing it uncritically to people who are then constructed as kind of sort of heroes in the cause. So we can't know everything about everybody, and that's fine. But I think it's important to think about, and I think what it turns around to for me is to think about how what the struggle is like for me, and how to be attentive to the consequences of my own practices and learn from them, and allow myself to make mistakes, heaven knows, but to to make an attempt at least at some kind of consistency and coherence.
Thank you very much. In the beginning, I was thinking whether I should mention my experience, because it'd be perhaps too selfish to ask for possible directions from you, with all these people wanting to know answers for their questions. But I thought that maybe you touched on so many points that they will probably want to draw on this to continue their conversation. And although I mentioned that I had a couple of questions in the beginning, I think I might ask Makoni if he wants to jump in and ask one or two questions that he might have before we open for discussion.
Yes, Bonnie, Monica, thank you very much for agreeing to come and talk to us about your book. I read your book when me and Alistair Pennycook were writing our book called Innovations and Challenges to Applied Linguistics from the Global South. And I reread it again in preparation for this particular discussion. So the questions I'm going to raise, my interpretation of your work, not as reflected in the book that we wrote, but as reflected in the discussion after we'd finished writing our own book. What I found striking about your work was the extent to which the other parts of the globe were more or less silent. I understand you said at the very beginning that you're writing from Canada and the United States, but viewing the sociolinguistics and viewing aspects about colonialism outside North America, the world seems to be very different. In other words, what I'm asking is, what does sociolinguistics look like outside the North American space? Was your main interest was to move towards a critical history of language colonialism and capitalism. So my question is, what does it look like from the other side of the world?
I'll try to respond, right? That's not I'm not going to answer because that's not a question I can answer. I think we actually didn't arrive at that title until the very, very, very end of the process. And it's important that we were actually initially asked to write a textbook and an introductory textbook for linguistic anthropology and an accompanying reader. And we didn't want to do that, and it took us a while to figure out why, and we kind of did a bait and switch and went back to UT Press and said, we don't want to do what you've asked us to do. We want to do something different, because for us, the textbook format is canonical. It defines a field without situating itself. And we had been feeling for a while that there were a lot of questions that we had that we couldn't ask within the framework of the field that we had been socialized into and were practicing. And so we felt we had to rethink a lot of things in order to be able to arrive at some other way of asking questions. So I think, I hope that we were clear that in writing this book, we're not trying to define a field. We're not trying to make a definitive statement. What we're trying to do is to open up a way of thinking broadly about the relationship between communicative, meaning making and social processes in which issues of power and inequality are centered, rather than kind of carved off in some way, and to suggest that there's lots of different ways in which we enter this set of conversations. We don't know them all for obvious reasons. And so it seemed that the best way in which we could enter this conversation was from how we got into it.
Okay.
So that you know our voices, and so that we can enter into conversation with you.
Right, that's fair. So let me then continue with my thoughts. In the book somewhere, I can't remember what page it is, you in a very tantalizing way, and I think I agree with you, that you say that there are certain notions about language which at times may look liberatory, but they may end up being repressive, and there are some that may begin as repressive and then may be used for liberatory purposes. And I was just trying to go through my own mind, and I was asking myself, what are the concrete examples that you had in mind when you're talking about how certain notions about language, which may initially begin as liberatory, but may end up as repressive, and some may begin as repressive, but may end up being liberatory. What specific notions about language did you have in mind?
Bonnie, do you want to start there with that one?
Makoni, if I may, if I can speak to your last question and this one.
Okay.
Because it's an important question that you're asking. There's no one book. There's no one book.
Yeah.
There should not be one book that speaks to all of the different historical predictions and trajectories. So we're situated, the two of us, as we noted in the introduction, in a powerful peripheral position with respect to the American Empire. We're in Canada. We're both American trained. I'm American and also now Canadian. We're both white, and there are certain kinds of questions we felt we needed to ask as people who are in the center of one powerful empire, the American Empire, and also in another powerful country, a settler colonial state, Canada. And we were excavating the tradition that shapes our work, which is in the ways of empire, a kind of voracious one, right? There are ways in which work that's happening within other traditions is picked up. There are other parts of those traditions that are ignored, and there are parts of it that have ventriloquized and not properly cited, right? They're taken up, and that the work is taken to be the work of scholars from the empire, when in fact the work has happened elsewhere. And so what we were trying to think a bit about was what happens in the elaboration of ideas, kind of at the center of this American and American empire and Canadian settler colonial nation. And you know, for us, one example would be the tradition of phonetics, as it was formed, is often like the history of that is written as an innovation, a scientific innovation that started in Britain in the 19th century. But that work was elaborated in complex and rich conversation with the traditions for analyzing language in India at the time, and they were part of that colonial conversation. Some of those conversations were obscured. The long contributions of the Sanskrit tradition were obscured. We've argued too in the book that in the 60s, a number of American sociolinguists who are part of these big development schemes are sent to a range of sites in the world. And again, India is one of them. Don Gumpers, William Bright, a number of people who are often associated with the American sociolinguistic tradition and have powerful positions in that tradition, did work in India. And sometimes what happens is that the scholarly traditions are erased in the ways those stories are retold, that that they were seen to be inspired by their field work, rather than by exchanges with scholars and scholarly traditions. And Gumpers would say it was the sociolinguistic traditions, not just the communities that he encountered that inspired him, but that work of erasure and reframing is partly what we're trying to show. And, you know, the ways that certain kinds of traditions that are articulated in some of the areas that are colonized by the US, so like work on Creoles that is coming out of Hawaii, and the work on Pigeons and Creoles is coming out of the Caribbean, are critical. They're critical. They are very important sites. They are key sites for thinking about decolonial work, anti-racist work, for challenging existing traditions in even like the notion of a family tree, what a family means. But that work is often kind of off to the side, or in parallel traditions, it's not centered fully. And so we were trying to make sense of the kinds of questions we could not ask, why it's so tough to ask certain kinds of questions that are critical of capitalism. What happened in the American Empire to make questions around political economy hard to ask? And that Cold War chapter is us looking at the active suppression of intellectuals and ideas. And those intellectuals and ideas, those were the progressive intellectuals of the time. They were mostly white, they were mostly male, a number of them were Jewish. So that's who was in the American Academy at the time. But those folks are asking questions about anti-Semitism. They were asking questions about miscegenation. They were asking questions about anti-Black racism. They were asking, in a certain way, questions about indigeneity. Some of them were working on indigenous languages. And those voices were written out. They were either taken right out of the academy, they were drummed out of the academy, or their voices, you know, were silenced because they received so much critique. So someone like Melville Jacobs. So we're looking at how an empire polices its intellectual tradition and creates it, knowing full well that what that requires then is we need to know more of those histories as they are told, not from the empire, but from the global south, but also understanding that the global south is in the empire. So, and you know, indigenous nations are created as dependents within the empire, but it's not the way the nations so understand themselves. Some of those voices that we draw on are indigenous voices from this place. We talk about the water walkers. We cite a number of indigenous scholars because those are the scholars who are speaking back from within as well as from without. So there's a certain, you know, sometimes people use that word, the term the fourth world, describe indigenous nations within. I think that's another thing, and I'm very interested in thinking about the solidarities that emerge between subaltern groups in different sites, and I think that's going to be an exciting conversation. And the people in this room are going to be are already, Sinfree, like your book, and then other people in this room are building those conversations. So that's exciting, and I'm going to be, you know, just sitting back and learning about that. Question?
I think I mustn't be too open about it. When I was preparing for this particular session, I was reading your book together with I was rereading the book by Rowan Cornell on Southern theory in an attempt to see how I could frame my arguments about your work from that particular Southern theoretical perspective. And towards the last part of her book, she talks about something that is similar to what you are discussing now, the importance of analyzing the local intellectual traditions in different parts of the world, and at times looking at the nature of the relationships between the different peripheral systems, let's say whether Southern Africa, Brazil, and Australia, etc., to see how ideas percolate in those different places. Okay. But before, let me ask you the last question, then I will open the discussion. since you are interested in dealing with the indigenous communities, where does the issue of land fit in your notion of sociolinguistics?
I'm actually going to much more about this than I have, but I'm going to say
okay.
that, which is that, and it's partly in, picking up on your last question as well, which is that I think the issue is for me is how to imagine a set of conversations in which we see things radically differently, but can still talk to each other.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So in that sense, again, I don't think we're after a theory of sociolinguistics, right?
No, okay.
We're after, or I'm after, I'll speak for myself, a way of understanding that there are all kinds of different ways and all kinds of different fields in which ideas circulate that are consequential for all of us. And so, part of the job is to understand how power works.
Yes.
One of the things that we've shied away from, that sociolinguistics as an institutionalized global north field has shied away from, is understanding the workings of power and what is erased as a result. What we don't see as a result. But there are ways in which sometimes this, dominant field needs to shut up and listen, right?
Yes.
not be universal, not be this kind of enlightenment universal frame for everybody, but rather maybe more helpfully can think about how to make bridges across positions, which, ways of understanding the world, ways of being in the world, which are radically different from each other for excellent and understandable reasons, and which don't necessarily need to be subsumed under one. The relationship to the land, to water, to air, to the material world is certainly something that we have in common. We think about it differently. The issue for me is, what are the consequences of the ways in which we think about it, not just for us, but for everybody else that we live with?
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, I have a couple of other questions, but I think I should stop asking and open the discussion to everybody. Shaila, where are you?
Makoni?
Yes.
In the beginning, I mentioned that if people could use the chat box to signal if they want to ask questions. And there are already 2 people who wrote to me saying that they wanted. So the first one is Sibus, and then Attila, and then Shaila, you are third, if that's okay.
Right.
Yeah, great, thanks. Sibus, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. My question really is about the issue of citation. And I noticed that the preoccupation, at least in sociolinguistics, is to discuss the issues around Delhines, whether to cite him or not to cite him. While that is very important, there seems to be an issue that then gets sidelined in the process. And that is the citation of Black women scholars, whether African Americans or Africans. I have noticed over the years that in citational practices, the tendency is to focus on white women writing in the West rather than citing other scholars. If you cite other scholars writing outside the US or who are Black, or even those writing in the West who are non-white, you are often during the review process reminded that, well, the individuals that you cite are unknown. Why don't you cite so and so and so and so and so and so? And often those are the big names of white women in the West. So for me, it seems as if that the acknowledgement of Black women's intellectual production is often not a central issue in our scholarship. In so doing, it seems, at least it comes across as if spaces of knowledge production do silence and erase Black women from the academy. And even here, we have just talked about Delhines, but that part of issues related to Black women, whether even in feminist scholarship, it's the same practice. So I would like perhaps maybe Monica and Bonnie to comment on how they see this.
I appreciate your question. I did a study a few years ago on citational practices in the field. It was published in a journal. I analyzed 5 journals, and it was published in the journal in which citation practices of women came out best. And we were looking at that politics of citation. How is theory constructed? Who is seen as theoretical? Whose voices are cited? And you know, in one section in the book, we draw on Marceliana Morgan's work on Claudia Mitchell Kernan. And Marceliana Morgan is an African-American woman scholar who describes the way that for her, Claudia Mitchell Kernan was a key early figure in thinking about sociolinguistics, one of the earliest Black women scholars in the field. And yet her work is often not cited in the histories of the field. And she talks about the ways that the reviews of her work, her early work, dismissed her, in part because she was of the community. And we're quite explicit in the comments. And so she looks at that erasure as she rewrites another version of the history. So I think that's a call. It's a call to all of us to think about who we're centering in our discussions as theoretical. And it's a call to deepen the work. Like once we get started, we're not done. Like, you know, sometimes people find one person. Now, you know, maybe they find Marceliana Morgan, or maybe they find Claudia Mitchell Kernan, and that person then becomes that person and so that's problematic. That's a problematic practice as well. So the framing of our book is deliberate in saying, we were talking about walking backwards into the future, and we have three theoretical frameworks. One is Raymond Williams, you know, a socialist scholar who comes from another periphery, Wales, a periphery. He's also a powerful periphery. And he's thinking about socialist work, and he has certain lacuna. Edward Said has noted the ways in which his form of socialism is not attentive to the role that Britain has in the global, as a colonial power when he writes about city and country. He has certain things to contribute, and he has certain lacuna. Sylvia Winter, who's a Black Caribbean-based scholar and artist, who is seen as central in many discussions, I think, here in Canada, because of the ways in which she's thinking about reimagining what human is, reimagining relationships between indigeneity and Blackness, and because she also uses a theoretical framework that's about narrative. And then the third theoretical perspective is drawn from Indigenous women, and this circles back to Makoni's question about land, who have been there's a Anishinaabe elder, Josephine Mendamenba, who about a decade and a half ago started walking around each of the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes contain 20% of the world's fresh water. So these are months-long journeys, and she was in her 60s. She started to walk around the Great Lakes, and at first it was just herself and her sister. She walked it, and it was a way of reclaiming knowledge of the place, reclaiming names where English names had been laminated on. She walked around each of the lakes, and as she walked, more and more people started to walk with her. Other people started to do water walks. They were led largely by Indigenous women around other water bodies. At one point she did, her last walk was in her mid-80s, and she started in Minnesota and she walked around each of the Great Lakes, the whole, around the Great Lakes, and then out the St. Lawrence Seaway. And it's her story to tell. There are videos of her describing the things that she learned and the things she picked up along the way, and what it means to take that and imagine a different kind of future. But those are three theoretical perspectives that for us frame the work. And I don't claim to know all that I need to know. But this is one of the moments where I'm thinking about where do I draw inspiration, not, from theoretical work and ethnographic work, and then that kind of rewriting of history that Marceliana Morgan is offering. So what would it mean to center Claudia Mitchell-Kernan in our understanding of the origin of sociolinguistics in the 60s in the United States instead of Heimskumpers and Labov?
And
how does that change our way of what does that change our sense of what the central question should be? So thank you.
She's an interesting case. I mean, she's one of those cases which links up to the interest that we had in the Committee on Sociolinguistics, since she is someone who explicitly was mentioned as somebody who could be invited, and yet somehow never was. So there's just two things that I wanted to add in response to your question. One is that I think one of the things that we discovered was that you can find a person, and as Bonnie said, you could stop there, but it always happened that when we would come across something that we hadn't, maybe a name we'd heard once upon a time but never thought about, this entire universe is attached to those networks. And so that's one way of discovering what has been erased, because there's always something attached, there's always something there that involves many more people and many more ideas than come to the surface. But I'm also, I want to respond to you as the editor of a journal, of a journal which is often held up as being one of the most important journals in the world. And I take this as a challenge, right? How to do this better. How to be attentive to every last detail of the practice of what we do. Who I want to invite as associate editors, or who do I think I am to accept an invitation, right? to that position. Who can I work with? Who do you invite as reviewers? What do you do with the reviews? We've just started an initiative which, for the purposes of internal communications, we're calling Decentering the Anglosphere. How do we do this in really concrete, practical terms? Because if we can't do it in our everyday practice, I don't know where we're gonna go. And I've been talking to Miguel Perez Milans, who's one of the co-editors of Language Policy. We're trying to develop a conversation around this. And, there are lots of us. We understand this as an issue, and we have to find the ways of practicing. And I sort of feel like we're trying to help each other. And I'll take all the help I can from you to figure out how to do things differently.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just the last comment, a small comment on that. I think from experience, what becomes a challenge by not letting Black women into scholarship is that how can we then challenge some of the theoretical frameworks that exist that do not address issues that are pertinent to our own local communities if we do not have the space to do so? That's the only comment that I can make.
Right, and that is where, so speaking from my position, was a position of a reasonable amount of power as editor of a journal, how do I help those spaces happen?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the next on the list is Achila, who was kind enough to send the question beforehand, but I didn't manage to ask in the beginning. So now I pass on the word to him so he can ask it himself. You're muted. There, now I think we can. No, I think you have to unmute yourself, Attila. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So nice to be here. Thank you very much. The book has inspired me to remember that the World Bank made some interventions in the Amazon in the 70s and in the 80s in the small farm, kind of land reform the military government would say. And I saw the Suruí native people have problems with the kind of intervention from the World Bank. And the money was for the big companies to build the road, asphalt the road, the money from World Bank. It caused many other problems in the Amazon, destruction of the forest, the fauna and flora, etc. So after those years, I started doing my PhD now after my master's degree in 1980s in Brasilia. And now I'm trying to put together those ideas, the rationalist, positive idea that the economics show us. And I learned so much with your book. In terms of, you say a rhizome, you connect ideas, culture, language, education, and we do need an transdisciplinary approach to better understand and connect people. So I'm working with children, public schools here in Petropolis, and now, after reading the book, I'll have to pay attention the way I speak, the things I do with the students in the communities, most of them in vulnerable situation, feel on the road to conflict with the law. They come from the judge and so on. So I would like you to comment a little more about the rhizome, the idea of the rhizome that you say about this interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and mainly the language, the way you can motivate the people to look for some kind of different education that's not just top down, so that people can build together and get motivation to understand the historical process they're living in. You brought history to my soul. You brought history. You brought so many interesting things. And I know I have a small time to talk about, so I have so many comments, maybe 37 questions here. So I just stay here with this one. Please, could you comment on you know, the difficulties, the problems, and mainly the possibilities when you are working with people and students to make language be more than a mode of education, but something you can share with them. Listen to the way they understand the reality. I don't know if I could express myself well.
Oh, you expressed yourself eloquently. There's a lot in that question. There's a set of questions about land reform. There's a set of questions about the metaphors we use, trees or rhizomes for understanding language. And there's a question about what does anti-oppressive education look like? And that's absolutely at the center of, those three questions are actually at the center of my work. And it actually loops back around to the question we didn't answer that McElhinny asked about language and land. So thank you. It gives us a chance to go a little bit farther. I'm going to give a little bit of context for my recent work and link it back to these responses. So Raphael mentioned that I'm now working on water. And you might be saying to yourself, what does this work on language, capitalism and colonialism have to do with decolonial approaches to water? And there are a number of reasons why I'm thinking about water. One is, you know, in the final chapter of the book, we focus on a number of ways in which things are commodified, including language. And I wanted to think about sites where people are imagining a commons rather than a commodity. And water is a site that people more readily imagine as a commons than sometimes land. Although the work that you do on water absolutely ends up shaping what happens on land. Water can be commodified too. Nestle, the international company, extracts water from aquifers in Southern Ontario and pays hundreds of a fraction, like 1/100th of a penny, and then sells the bottles worldwide. So you can commodify water. Water can be privatized, but water is something that is critical for people's life, and people resist understanding it as a commodity. And there's been very successful pushback against privatization of water in a range of sites. So water is also it is absolutely characteristic of this place. So one of the things I'm trying to think about is what is the work that's shaped by the land and water of this place. And 20% of the world's fresh water is in the Great Lakes. So this is a place that has lakes and rivers everywhere. It shapes the way we imagine our everyday lives. So I wanted to think about a place-based approach. And it doesn't mean it's narrowly constrained, right? The water, some of the fish that are in the Great Lakes migrate from the Caribbean. So there are complex connections and conversations that are being created. So I wanted to think about water. I wanted to think about the kinds of alliances, and I won't say unlikely because that's a pessimistic form of a pessimistic approach to social change, but I will say unprecedented, that have emerged in this site for thinking about how we work around water. And there are a number of unprecedented alliances linking labor and indigenous groups, linking people who are thinking about food security and food sovereignty from Black communities, indigenous communities, and other food insecure communities. There are multi-faith alliances thinking about the sacredness of water. And I thought I was thinking about water, but the indigenous elders here note that in order to understand this place, people need to understand the Anishinaabeg language, because many of its place names encode stories, theories, and relationships with water. So for me, one strategy is thinking, if we identify a problem as commodification, identifying another site, understanding the commons in indigenous territory and thinking about the work that's happening there and what it is doing as a pushback against, but creating also alternatives. And that work on water and land those are forms of reform. They are reimagining how food systems work and how water works, and in ways that I think are revolutionary. So then I want to think about this idea of, we've used a number of natural metaphors for thinking about language. One is the family tree, and we talk about the way in which that, and Said talks about the way in which that notion of a family tree comes about at a certain moment of colonial understanding of language, and that there are challenges to that. The work that happens on Pigeons and Creoles is a critical and central challenge to thinking about family in particular ways, and to thinking about relationship in particular ways. And a rhizome is another strategy for challenging those more tree-like metaphors, but the rhizome is still a metaphor. So one of the questions might be, it's still a terrain on which we are imagining human life. But what happens if plants and animals and land and water are not the terrain on which we're imagining what it means to be human, but are placed fully in the conversation? And for Indigenous people on these territories, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, the water is kin. It's kin. The plants are kin. Each of these things also speaks in its own way. So when we think about language, the focus on language is very human-centric. Even the more progressive, understandings that center language as what it makes us distinctively human, separates humans from other things. And so what might it mean to imagine those other forms of communication, how those things speak, how we make sure we're not speaking for them. You know, all of those lead us towards, lead me towards, because some of you might already be there and I'm just catching up, but asking how we think about communities in particular places, the ways in which they're shaped by those places, the ways in which we responsibly build interactions with each other and with those, the places, the land and water of the place. So, and then the question of anti-oppressive education, I will say, you know, this week I'm feeling somewhat pessimistic because I think many of the institutions that we're in are not meant to build forms of solidarity and care. Large research-based institutions like the one that Monica and I are in are often set up to sort. You know, they're set up to sort out and to create hierarchies with marking systems, with the merit pay schemes that are used, with student competition for space and resources. And so we have to work within those, and I'm looking for the sites within the institution that are working actively against that sorting and creating relationships of solidarity and care. There's an enormous apparatus in place. For me, sometimes the moments that are most inspiring are the moments when I'm able to take students right outside of the classroom that exists in the university and imagine other forms of classrooms and build conversations with communities that have already done some of this work. And I could offer two examples that are built around circle. I don't want to take too much time. I'll offer one. But one is Canada celebrates itself as a site of multiculturalism in ways that obscure colonial and racist practices. And a few years ago, with a group of students, we did a solidarity trip to the University of Hawaii, Manoa, where they have a service learning program, a community engagement program. And students in that program spend time throughout the year doing work on the land and in community in thoughtfully supervised ways, in ways that are shaped by community members. And we joined some of the activities. One of them was a circle of people in a working class community who had fought back against a gated community. There's a gated community that was being built for people who can afford to live in gated communities in Hawaii. So wealthy, middle class, upper middle class, people high up in the mountains. But it was a place where people grew things. There was community gardens. They fought back, and they successfully fought back against the gated community. They fought back against the gated community. They got a 100-year lease to build community gardens. They hired a few people to maintain the gardens, but then members of the community could participate in those gardens once a week and or once a month. And if they did, on the day that they participated, they helped tend the gardens. They learned to tend the gardens. They gained those skills. At the end of each workday, there was a feast where people met and worked and talked together. And they each took away a box of food from the farm. And the food from that farm also supported the local hospital, a cafe in the local hospital. And that hospital was trying to think about health and care for bodies, minds, and souls that were dealing with the physical, mental, and spiritual trauma of being in a capitalist and colonial society. So there was a holistic sense of health there. And the work, I guess, the work that inspires me here is work where people are doing some of the same kinds of things. They're fighting back against the gated communities. That has to be a bit, and that can be a metaphor, sites of exclusion, but also creating circles of solidarity and care, maybe trying to find some strategies that don't rely on global supply chains or problematic labor practices to produce food in everyday life, and that try to imagine health differently. So those are the places where I'm trying to kind of invest my work. And there are comparable organizations. Sometimes you hear of an example somewhere else, or you encounter it, and then you come back and say, well, what's happening here? So there are organizations doing some of that same work on building community gardens on public land, on building solidarities between communities. Right now, especially, a lot of people are concerned about food. Part of the reaction to COVID was people were concerned about interruption of global food chains. And in Canada, as well as elderly people in long-term care homes being a site where there are large numbers of COVID cases and deaths, so too are some of the food processing sites, the meat processing plants, and agricultural workers have been, because they've been housed in barrack-style sites. So we're diagnosing a range of ways in which food and work need to be rethought. And so, so for me, that's the response to questions of thinking about land reform and rhizomes. Rhizomes become quite literal in this model. People are growing things, and anti-oppressive education.
Let me just add, I don't want to, I think there's a lot of people want to ask questions, but just two quick things. One is that I think a lot of what I learned from the book is how much work it took to extract language from the rest of social life. And so part of what I think we're talking about is reimagining, well, so what if we didn't? What if language weren't extracted? That's institutionally a challenge, because most of us have our credentials and our jobs based on some kind of expertise in something called language. But that was something that got concocted and can get unconcocted. The other quick comment I just wanted to make is that any metaphor we use, any way in which we talk about things, has consequences. So it has affordances. Thinking about things as trees and as descendants and kinship, indeed, allows certain kinds of things, and it cuts off other kinds of possibilities. I think, both Bonnie and I are interested in looking at things in ways that are more interconnected, but that allow for an understanding of the complex, often hard to predict, sometimes perverse consequences of things working, of the ways in which things work together. But that it is, for me, certainly, I feel like it's part of my job to try to understand. But that then requires me to think about things as not structured in a top-down way, and not requiring particular units of things which are homogeneous and bounded off from each other. But maybe we should take more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question and questions.
Yes, now we have two more people who would like to ask questions, Shala and then RM back, and we have 20 minutes left. So if we could try to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Hi, this is Shaila from the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. I have really enjoyed reading your book in the sense that you mentioned about positionality and multiplicity and awareness. And in fact, you have positioned yourself very clearly, and the way you have weaved your own stories into the writing, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I have read many books about applied linguistics. I know that you have this specific focus, colonization, capitalism, but somehow you managed to give a very comprehensive, holistic understanding how this field has evolved over the years. So I think it will be a very good reference book for many of us for many years to come. I really didn't know about the stories behind all these famous people. For example, you mentioned about Gramsci, you mentioned about Lebov and Gompertz. I have read about them, but I haven't read about their interest and background and what have inspired them to come into this specific field. For example, Gompertz came to Indian subcontinent in 1947, and he worked for the language policy. It was very, even though I'm located in Bangladesh, this specific information was quite new for me, and I have found lots of information quite new. Saying that, I would also like to say that, you mentioned, your last sentence is quite compelling. You mentioned about walk backward to future. But when I think of walking backward to future from my context, I see that my backward is leading to colonialism itself for for more than 300 years. The ideas of colonialism have influenced our concept of language, our concept of language policies and practices. For example, I can give you one specific research that I'm doing at the moment. We have indigenous communities, very small number of indigenous communities. And the classes, the primary school classes, all these classes are taken in Bangla, the national language. So in this classroom, and as well as in their linguistic, the indigenous languages are quite absent. They're not used at all. And even in informal domains, for example, families, the use of indigenous languages has becoming less and less because of the governmental policies and immense importance given to Bangla, the national language, and English. Now, when I talk to these teachers in this context, in fact, they are not ready to do anything at all for saving their languages, because they are more into, because they themselves see the commodification of language more pertinent to their life. And that's why the communities themselves want to learn Bangla. The communities themselves want to learn English. They are not at all interested to preserve their language. So in these situations, people like us, the researchers like us, what will we do? What should be our way for decolonizing ourselves, who are very much aware of all the theories that have been introduced by the European applied linguists. At the same time, when people here in the community are very much influenced by the ideologies indirectly, and they are more into into what they say, into the materialistic achievements that they may have through languages. So what ways we can decolonize our own selves in our practices?
So for me, the issue is not one, I guess, purely of ideology, but it is material, in the sense that there are reasons why people do what they do, and in that sense, I think our job is to understand and take really seriously why it is that people value what they value. Usually it's a really reasonable understanding of what, to use Bourdieu's term, what the linguistic market is like, and what one's position is within that, and what kind of access to resources you do or do not have, and how you can get what you need to get in order to survive and prosper. And so I don't think it's a matter so much of decolonizing minds as it is of understanding what the nature is of the systems in which we're located, in which languages, the value attributed to language, named languages or linguistic varieties or whatever we want to call it, how those are bound up with the possibility of participating in spaces where important symbolic and material resources are produced, where their value is attributed, where their circulation is controlled. And so the real question is, what is the material source of the value that's attributed to linguistic resources, and what options, what opportunities people have to position themselves with respect to that. Within that, I think it is really important, Bonnie mentioned this earlier, to think about what it is that educational institutions do. We are taught to think of them as avenues of social mobility, avenues of opportunity, but as agencies of the state, they're also about making the right kind of citizen. They're about disciplining bodies and minds, and they're about doing social selection. Bourdieu and Passeron and New Sociology of Education in the 60s and 70s. There's a lot of work about the sorting mechanism and the ways in which there's discursive masking of the social selection processes that in many respects educational institutions are for. So I think we do have a problem of a disconnect between what we would like to believe about educational institutions, what we would like them to do and what they actually do. And so the work maybe lies there more than it lies in convincing people that their linguistic varieties, their languages, have more value than they think they do.
But the system itself is so much into this ideologically laden. So it becomes problematic to find a way of convincing the stakeholders, the government, the education system, and at the same time, the people who are at the grassroots level, they are not as well ready to mobilize themselves in order to raise their voice. So we are sort of stranded in the middle, trying to figure out in what ways we can address these issues. On the one hand, we have government and educational institutions which have certain ideologies, and they are working towards those ideologies. And at the same time, we have the people who are in the system who can, at the grassroots level, perhaps if they could have raised their voice some way or other, they could have made themselves visible to the government. But we can't make, any of these parties work the way, the things should be.
So,
yeah,
this is Marilyn Martin-Jones and I talked about this a long time ago in an introduction to a volume we edited called Voices of Authority, in terms of interstices. So there are different ways in which you can accomplish institutional change, right? And the challenge is whether, what's possible to do from within and what's not. But there are always spaces where things are not locked down tight. The spaces of contradiction, and you've put your finger on this huge contradiction for states legitimized through ideologies of democracy, which fail to deliver on the promise. So a contradiction is one space where you can start working at, okay, where do these contradictions show up in people's lives? Where do they show up in institutional practice? Those are the points where you can start making spaces to say, okay, how do we think about this contradiction? Where do we work with that? And that's, that's not a revolutionary concept, and it's not a revolutionary practice, but it's one that can have material consequences, maybe, most importantly locally and more broadly as things go on. But there are always those spaces. The image that always comes to mind that I always sort of talk about at this point is from the work of a former student of mine, Alessandra Renzi, who's now at Concordia in Montreal, who did work with the squatter movement. He was part of the squatter movement in Naples, where they, at a time when Berlusconi owned the entire media apparatus of Italian media, and they discovered, so there was like no possibility for using the media to develop any other kind of narrative than the one that Berlusconi had. But they discovered that the codes of broadcast would overlap in ways in which there, at a local level, at a neighborhood level, you could tap into the broadcast signal and do what they called pirate TV. And so they would set up neighborhood level TV stations where people from the neighborhood could come in and tap into Berlusconi's system and tell their stories, or talk, people could come and, yell at the neighbors for not dealing with their garbage properly, but to establish a difference a different conversational space, a different mediatized space from the state level one. So that's, you know, a material example of what I'm talking about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bonnie, would you like to add?
Well, I think in many ways we keep looping back to Makoni's questions, but you know, he had asked a question that I think we didn't answer at all, and that was a question about which ideas of language are liberatory, might look liberatory and then are not. And there's so many moments when there's people think they have an idea of what progress is going to be, and they create structures to impose that idea of progress on others. And in Canada, one of those examples is residential schools, where Indigenous children were taken from their parents and placed in educational institutions that were seen as preparing them for the future that the state thought was the right future for them. And of course, part of that practice was the erasure of Indigenous languages. People were punished for using languages. They were sites of a range of forms of violence. And this is where, you know, Monica's cautions about hope are ones I take on board, because there are hopes that are racist, and there are hopes that are sexist, and there are hopes that are violent. There was a hope embodied in that project. It was a problematic form of hope. It was the eradication of Indigenous ways of being, including Indigenous languages. There are a lot of moments where I'm wary of benevolence, including my own, right? You know, so I think we need to rethink ideas of progress, but we can't do it for other people. People will imagine for themselves what that progress needs to be. And what we can do as educators is not, I think it's not imagining what progress is. I think it is helping people to create, helping to support people in becoming competent resistors. And then they can resist as they see fit. There's a toolkit that you need to create a competent resistor. You need to be able to diagnose institutions. You need a set of histories. You need a set of social media tools these days. You need a set of writing tools. So we can help people become competent resistors, and they can ask the questions and move the work forward. I do think that what our work requires, I do think what our work is requiring us to do is reimagine time and reimagine space and reimagine what it means to be a person. All of those things are happening in our work. And part of reimagining time is asking what we imagine progress to be. And reflecting not just on other people's notions of progress, but our own. What is it that we imagine it to be? And how is that shaping our work? I think the question of place is something I spoke to earlier. Like, what does it mean for us not to be entirely what does that mean for us not to be disembodied, as in some ways we are in this conversation, but what does it mean to be fully anchored in the place where we are and think about the questions that emerge from that place, its histories, but also like the land and the water and the plants and the animals are there. They shape the life of, you know, all of that, the rivers that run in Toronto, the lakes, the rivers that were buried as the city was being built all shaped the life of this city. And how does it imagine, like, what do we imagine a good person to be? And I have been in plenty of circles, and I imagine you have been too, progressive sites, where I felt like people were not embodying the future that I wanted us to be working in. And there are moments when I have to work on what it means to work collectively, because I have been educated in a competitive system. Like, what does it mean to work collectively? What does it mean to work with kindness and care?
And if I could just jump in, and in that sense, I think it's a matter not just of trying to, you know, work towards competent resistance, but also competent wielding of power.
But
I think Rosemary wants to say something. Raphael.
Yeah, I just wrote to Raphael that I can step down, but because you were just saying this, Monica, about we have to wield power, I keep coming back to this question of theory and of critical history, because I think both theory and history powers in the term itself, right? You still have to be critical.
We can't hear you very well.
There's something wrong with the audio.
It's cut.
Perhaps you could put your question in the chat. Unfortunately, we're not hearing the question.
We can't hear you.
No? Okay, then I'm fine. Okay. Sorry.
But type it in the chat.
Yeah, okay.
But we can hear you. If you go further.
We can hear you. It's just you seem a bit far from the audio itself or something.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think I sometimes have problems with this, with my microphone and everything. Is it now better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking of theory and history have inbuilt hierarchy or inbuilt power. And you still have to say, I'm doing critical theory and I'm doing critical history. And I was thinking of this new notion of account, where in accounting, first you make clear it's one possible perspective. You also have to show how you account and what you account for and from which perspective. And this is also one way of how to renounce this power that is inherent in Northern theory and which would also be there in Southern theory. After all, we have to argue our point and not just make reference to concepts, to theories, histories, and so on. So this is something I keep coming back again and again, and this would be one very practical way of, stepping out of these kind of power relations into the argument of how do I see things and how do I argue for them. That was my comment, actually. Thank you very much for this nice conversation here.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of ways in which we tried to write in exactly that way. There are limits to our abilities to. It's a lot easier to account for somebody else's trajectory than it is to account for one's own. So that's the reflexive turn in some ways. The issue still remains, though, of the what counts as a legitimate account and who gets to decide, what makes sense, what's convincing, what's persuasive. And that's still a matter, but that opens it up as a matter of struggle, at least.
Of academic debate. That is exactly where we need to start debating, where you cannot say mine is better because I am white or I am so-and-so or whatever I am. But there starts the academic, the intellectual, the scientific debate. That is the interesting thing about it. With this, you can really circumvent all questions. We have to come back to the moment of academia.
Yeah, I think because we're linguists, it's thinking about what does the statement do? Here in Canada, and perhaps I would welcome hearing what the discussion is from each of the sites where you're at. Many institutions are issuing statements of solidarity this week, statements that are critical of policing violence, that are critical of anti-Black racism. And there's a profound discussion about that. There are companies that have never done the work that are issuing these statements. The University of Toronto's president issued a statement. I drafted a statement for the college, and there's a series of conversations about where we need to go beyond the debate to say the statement does not perform the action that it describes as needed. And who has the right to speak about what needs to be done, and in what ways are statements a performance of a form of virtue, and I would say in this context a performance of white virtue, that don't actually push us into making the institutional transformations that are required. So I want us to think about the ways in which our work, I guess in what ways does our work move beyond being a statement about what needs to be done, a description about what needs to be done, a form of solidarity expression? When and how does that work engage in the practice of institutional transformation, engage in doing the work that we're describing. So universities are a critical site for that work. They're a critical site for that work. When I look at the college that I'm in, although it houses programs, as I mentioned, in African Studies, Equity Studies, and Caribbean Studies, it supports student organizations. There's been very little work done over the past 40 years in proactively recruiting Black staff into student service facing positions. So, there's work to do. There's work to do. There's always work to do. And so we need to think about the very real power we wield in the institutions that we're in to undertake transformations and think about the exclusions, inclusions, and ongoing work. So that's accountability as well.
Monica, did you signal you wanted to add something to the response, or I misread your raising hand?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, unfortunately, we're reaching the end of this very stimulating discussion, and I'd like to thank once again Bonnie and Monica for so kindly accepting this invitation to join us today, and of course, all of you who attended and asked questions and commented on the chat, because you made the discussion happen, and I'm really glad to see this happening. It started off almost 2 years ago with Alistair, Makoni, Limario, and perhaps 1 or 2 more people trying to discuss on decoloniality by Mignolo and Wash, and saying 4 to 5 participants to 55 or 60 today. It's really, really nice. So thank you so much. Makoni, would you like to make some final comments?
Yes. Next month, we are going to have a discussion with Chris Hatton. He is going to be discussing his book, Language and the Third Reich. After that, we'll move on to a discussion by Kwesi Pra, who is based in Cape Town. You'll be talking, I think, on decolonizing higher education. And then we move on to John Bowie, who is at the University of Washington. You'll be talking about language and housing discrimination amongst the African Americans. And then we move on to Rowan Cornell, who will be talking about a book called The Good University. And then we move on to Mahmoud Mamdani, who is a professor at Columbia University and Makerere University, who will be talking about his new book, which will be published in November, called Neither a Settler Nor a Colonialist. And then we move on, I think, to Nick Reimer, who is a linguist at the University of Sydney. He'll be talking about the politics of epistemology in language studies. And then we'll move on to a discussion by Linda Smith, where she'll be discussing a book, Decolonizing Research Methods. And we will conclude the year with a discussion led by Robbie Shilliam, who is at Johns Hopkins, called The Black Academia. Right. I would like to thank everybody for participating. I think it has been wonderful to have a chance of listening and to engage with you all. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Bonnie and Monica?
Bonnie and Monica, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for allowing us to join this incredible and this unbelievable conversation. It's quite a privilege.
You know, it's really fascinating. It's just fascinating. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Raphael Makoni, thank you very much. And I'm putting my email up in the chat. I welcome the opportunity to hear more about the work of this group. This is an amazing forum that the two of you have convened, an amazing lineup. And for me, the point of these is getting an opportunity to hear more about work that other people are doing. So I'm putting my email up in the chat. I would welcome hearing from you in email, or if your work is in a place where you're prepared to share it, I would love to create further conversations. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, it's interesting. You were talking, for example, about water epistemology. The last couple of chapters that I did with Christine Severo and Ashraf, talked to some extent about the notion of water and trying to use water as metaphors to talk about language, etc., so that you move beyond the land or terra-centric notion about language. So it was quite interesting to see how we seem to have arrived at a similar position, but perhaps starting from different perspectives. Right. Because the interesting argument that we are making in the water epistemology is that the challenge is not so much about language itself, but it is how you are framing language, right? That in some cases it is how we've been thinking about language, which has been creating the problem. So we then say, okay, what are the other alternative ways of thinking about language? And that's where the issues about water epistemology and all that come into play. It's really, and I liked your discussion also about, in your book, how the African studies programs were funded and the emergence of Africanists in different parts of the world. I thought that was very interesting. Yes, I thought that was very interesting. It was very interesting.
We'd love to talk more about that.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that. Yes. I want to talk more about it. I wanted to talk about it, but I thought, no, I would want to have a different forum.
I think one of the limitations of online gatherings like this is keeping it within the time and allowing everyone to speak. So I know that perhaps the discussion could keep going, but we agreed with the guests that it would last and the participants 90 minutes, and we are already 10 minutes past, and we know that in this format it can be difficult to, so thank you very much everyone for attending. And I look forward to further conversations with you.
Okay, Raphael, thanks a lot. Thanks for setting this thing up. Okay. Right.
Bye.
Bye.